Excellent. Thank you very much, Melissa. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Thomas Humphreys. I'm the content manager at Prevalent, and I'll be here with you today to go through SIG 2023. So just bear with me a moment. Apologies. Excellent. Thank you. So I'm here with you today to go through SIG 2023, what's new and how it will impact your TPRM program. As said, I'm the content manager. I work to develop different frameworks and standards within the Prevalent platform based on existing and new and emerging standards and best practice frameworks, so the likes of SIG, ISO, and NIST, to name but a few. The purpose of today is for those of you who are familiar with SIG and also for those of you who are just starting on your journey with the SIG assessments. There's a yearly exercise that goes on to update the framework, and more often than not, this brings with it a whole host of significant changes, updates, tweaks to questions, and various other scenarios. And that's the purpose of today, is to go through and take a look at what's happened. So I'll give an introduction to SIG 23 for doing a comparison between 2022 and 23 assessments, taking a look at what happened last year. There's quite a big year last year for shared assessments and the SIG assessment framework, and looking at what this means and what's happened in 23. We'll be taking a focus on two of the bigger changes around fourth to nth party as a domain, and ESG or ESG risk as a domain as well. In the latter stages of the webinar, we'll then be going through SIG and what it means to third-party risk management in your RD TPRM program. We're taking a final conclusion around steps that you and your TPRM team and development teams should take now, both if you're just moving on to SIG 23 or looking to move on, or as say, if you're just starting out learning about SIG and are interested to use it as part of your program. As Melissa indicated, obviously throughout today, if there are any questions, please place them in the Q&A box or window, and then at the end of the webinar, hopefully time permitting, you should have space to answer a few of those questions. Without further ado, let's begin and look at introduction to SIG 23. So SIG, or Standardized Information Gathering Questionnaire, is a framework developed by the Shared Assessments Company, and it gives quite a wide range of controls and control domains that enable organizations to assess other businesses, principally third parties, against quite a comprehensive set of questions and requirements. It covers quite a large range of areas, from information security and cybersecurity to privacy and business and operational and organizational controls as well. In a similar vein to other frameworks such as the NIST 853s, ISOs, standards such as 27000 or 9001, they're reviewed on an annual basis and updated yearly as well. Principal aims are to determine whether the framework still remains and is fit for purpose. The content is relevant based on current operational activities, societal changes, industry and sector changes as well, and to identify any new and emerging topics as a result of this. So I say, like all major standards, it's updated on a yearly basis, and it really gives sort of emphasis on saying what we looked at last year and what was developed last year, is it still relevant? And changes and updates, which we'll go through shortly, can range from completely new modules, domains, question sets, or something as simple as adjusting language, adjusting text, to make a subject or a topic clearer to its target audience. On occasion, of course, there's also a potential for areas to be removed, to be deleted, if they're deemed surplus to requirement. There are other new and emerging technologies or activities out there that have replaced a current control or control group in some cases. One of the key things, particularly those who are just starting out in SIG, it's worth mentioning is shared assessments always developed two versions of its SIG framework, a light and a core assessment. As you'd perhaps guessed from the names, where the core is the all singing, all dancing, quite comprehensive framework covering all of these information security, cyber privacy and organizational controls. Light is very much a more of a cut down version of the same content. One of the key drivers there is when you're looking at smaller organizations or businesses or even third parties, vendors who are of perhaps lower priority or even lower tier. If you get to the stage where you're starting to tier and profile vendors. So there's two assessments that are always offered. And there's a lot of flexibility in both, again, that we'll see later on, whether you want to use one or both or a combination of singular or multiple domains in light and or core. So standards development helps to enhance the TPRM process, and the overall aim is to create an opportunity for businesses to review their priorities. So as I say, when the organizations such as shared assessments review SIG, they're looking at identifying, well, are there existing weaknesses or areas for improvement based on the current question sets? Do we need to realign and expand on how we map different standards together? Right from the early stages of SIG, there's always been a very clear and comprehensive mapping to best practice frameworks such as ISO 27001, NIST 853, and so on and so forth. And this is an area that we've typically found year on year has increased, whether it's those standards such as ISO that have updated their own framework, or where there are new standards, regulations, or frameworks that are deemed closely aligned to where SIG is going and the purpose of SIG. And finally, to look at renewed focus for critical risk areas. So where there's a need to pull out new domains, new hot topics. And it's important to highlight these, not just from understanding where the changes that are made to a standard such as SIG, but from an internal business perspective. It's always a good idea, once a new standard has been updated, has been refreshed, to sit back and say, well, what does this mean for us as an organization? Are there new topics that are being captured in the framework that we want to utilize because they're seen as critical to us, critical to our operations or our industry or sector? Or perhaps these are topics, new and emerging topics, as a result of new and emerging threats that have been occurring. And these are areas that seem to plug the gap or to enhance the level of control capability. So it's always important just to understand where those questions that have been enhanced, removed, or replaced, where those new and emerging topics exist, where there is additional or enhanced alignment to national, international standards, regulations and frameworks, and where those new topics or best practices give additional cause for contemplation and review to say, do we need to refocus what our aims are with our TPRM program and our use of the SIG? So it's an annual exercise, and over the last 4 to 5 months, shared assessments have been working to develop what has now been released over the last week or so. So how does SIG 22 compare to SIG 23? So anyone who's familiar and who've used SIG 22 or just starting to use SIG 22 will have noticed quite a significant update compared to previous years. And there's quite a few fundamental changes that were made. First off, there's an incredible expansion on categories across the SIG framework, whether it's brand new categories, enhancements to existing categories, or movement of categories based on the individual domain. So briefly, what is a category? So across the 18 or 19 domains that we'll see shortly, each domain has a set of controls and questions around access control, people management, business continuity, and so forth. And each of these are then categorized to add further depth to each section. So within incident management, there'll be categories specific around incident response or lessons learned or incident handling, for example. So there's an incredible increase in categories that shared assessments pulled into the 22 framework. Perhaps the biggest change is the reduction in question sets for light and core. SIG 2021 light had around 350 questions. SIG 22 light had 150. So there's a significant drop when questions were moved into the core framework or put into other detail outside of light. So it really reduced the volume of questions within the light framework. And as mentioned earlier, certainly updating of mappings to standards and regulations. And we can see some of these that were changed in 22. So new categories were added for fourth and nth parties, this concept of ESG. There were enhancements and updates made to incident management and the wider concept of incident management, and data and privacy controls, data governance, privacy governance as well. So a lot of new categories that were fit into existing domains, and that was one of the significant changes in 22. As I mentioned, also the question set was reduced from 350 to 150 in SIG Lite, and it was reduced by roughly 160 to 170 questions in the core as well. There were increased standards mappings in 22 as well. So NIST upgraded to revision 5 in the back end of 2021. The Cloud Security Alliance's CAKE standard for cloud service providers upgraded to version 4 in roughly the same time. And then there are new standard mappings coming out for areas such as 27701, which is a privacy information management standard based on ISO's 27001 information security standard. So there's quite a lot of work that went into 22, and this very much carries forward into 2023 as well. Not so much in terms of the volume of standards mappings or categories, but certainly other notable changes as well. And as I say, this reflected a larger commitment by SIG to make it ever more relevant to as many obviously businesses and operations as possible. So how does 2023 compare to 22? So 23 is built on the improvements of the previous year. And one of the most notable changes is it's turned some critical topics into standalone domains. So there's been restructuring of domains. There's been 2 new domains released, fourth and nth party management and ESG, which we'll cover off later on today. Been an increased focus in governance and management and controls around governance across a wide variety of the domains. And there have been some updated standards mappings as well. As we can see on the right-hand side, we have the 19 domains. There's been an increase of 1 domain. Those that are bold represent changed domains. And when I mean changed domains, it's either the domain name has changed, for example, compliance management and privacy management, where there's been a brand new domain, such as fourth to nth party management and ESG, or where there's been name changes, such as information assurance and IT operations management, but there's been additional enhancement in terms of the type of questions, question text changes, and new questions being embedded into those domains. As I mentioned, there were some updated standards as well. As you'd expect with the advent of a new domain for ESG, there are some ESG based regulations that are captured in there, whether we're looking at EU and UN based standards and regulations on sustainability, responsible investment, to UK laws around modern slavery, and anti-bribery and so on. Anyone from the US may be familiar with FedRAMP and FFIEC and NERC. FedRAMP is a US program. I believe it's Risk Authorization Management Program. It's very much geared towards security in cloud products and cloud services. FFIEC is from a financial perspective. It launches financial regulatory booklets, and one of the changes now is the outsourcing of technical services. And NERC, which is a US standard based on critical infrastructure or critical infrastructure protection. Says hasn't been as many standards updates made in SIG 23, but the ones they have made are still very important, and again enhances the type of organizations who are using the SIG, and where there's a genuine need to map to and understand compliance against various standards and frameworks. And that's one of the key things to note about the standards mapping. As I mentioned, when any new framework is updated, it's always important to take a step back to say, does it meet our requirements? And are there any new areas that we need to refocus on? And certainly enhancements with new or updated standards obviously brings that to the fore, particularly where there are organizations that are heavily using one or many of these standards, regulations, or laws as well. So, as we saw, one of the key first aspects was a restructuring of the domains, and I've identified several of them here. So before, in SIG 2022, we had security policy as a domain, and that's been replaced with nth party management. Organizational security has been replaced with information assurance. Compliance and operational risk replaced with compliance management. Privacy replaced with privacy management. And environmental, social, and governance, or ESG. Now, it's important to note, particularly around the likes of security policy, what this doesn't mean is they've removed everything associated with security policy and replaced it with nth party management. It means SIG has taken the elements of nth party management and the wider supply chain management that they had in SIG 22 and taken it out and captured it in a new domain. And anything from a security policy perspective around policy building, roles and responsibilities, and communicating on information and cybersecurity policies has been moved and replaced into, in this instance, information assurance. So there's been a rejigging of a lot of these areas, but all of the existing 18 domains still exist, and the concepts of them still exist, but there's been added emphasis on the 4 or 5 domains here: nth party, information assurance, compliance, privacy management, and ESG. So just briefly on each of these, I say I'll cover nth party and ESG in a short while, because these have perhaps some of the more important changes that have been made. In terms of information assurance, so I've indicated that security policy now feeds into information assurance. It's very much still geared towards developing an information security program and set of policies, and governance is one of the areas that's increased the most. I mentioned a few slides previously that governance and management is an area that has increased in SIG 23. And we can see that in both information assurance, compliance management, and privacy management. Sometimes even just the rewording of the domain itself, again, is worth then stepping back and looking at, well, what has practically changed within the area. And I'll be covering briefly across information assurance, compliance, and privacy in a short while. It is worth mentioning, I'll just quickly go back to the previous slide. One of the areas not covered there was IT operations management. Now, this was still an original name that was captured in SIG 22. So it's not a new domain name change. which is why it's not highlighted here. However, it is important to note that in a similar vein to information assurance, compliance and privacy, there has also been further expansion, both in terms of governance and management controls, and expanding the governance side of IT operations. So what do I mean by that? We're looking at the IT organizational structure, for example, looking at governance around reporting on performance of IT and IT operations. So, information assurance, IT operations, privacy management, and compliance management. So 4 domains that have changed in name, with the exception of IT ops management. And the key driver has been the corporate and data governance, security and privacy governance, and management oversight. And this is quite an interesting thing, I think, that shared assessments has done. There's a lot more emphasis to say, particularly when you think going out to third parties and delivering questionnaires that are focused around, talk to us about privacy and how you're managing privacy and personal data. Talk to us about how you're managing and reviewing key legislations and laws and staying on top of those laws. The fact that there's more information and more requirement to talk about the governance side just has an extra spin on I guess the purpose and drive for each of these sections. So not only are we asking third parties to say, well, do you have IT operations, and tell us about how you manage change and capacity management or patch management and system builds, but you want to also know about the governance and structure around that. So how you define roles and responsibilities, how do you report up to senior management and the board, particularly where there are significant changes to compliance or privacy laws or the way in which you're managing your critical operations. And so it's interesting that there's been added emphasis through new questions and also through amendment of existing questions, what's known as question text delta, where you've adjusted the question that already exists but makes it clearer or adds extra emphasis to the likes of governance and management control or expectation. So largely these 4 domains haven't changed in terms of the overall outcome and purpose, but it's that added emphasis on how these areas are being managed at the organizational level. And in the sense of privacy management, how it's also being managed in terms of supply chain and your third party relationship with third parties and their access to privacy and personal data. So moving on now to look at 2 of the larger areas, and these are the 2 domains that have been broken out from existing areas. 4th and nth party existed in the enterprise risk management domain. It very much stuck to a fairly high level in terms of the focus, but because it's now been separated in its own domain, one of the key drivers here is obviously maintaining that visibility of the wider supply chain. Certainly pertinent nowadays, particularly given you're looking at the range of continual threats and risks, the volume of continued ransomware attacks, not just targeted at particular organizations in the supply chain, but against particular products that could affect the wider supply chain. And as we know, it's becoming more of a common discussion point amongst boards and stakeholders as well. So 4th to nth party management in SIG 23 focuses on policies, standards and procedures, executive sponsorship, contracts and agreements, inventory and assets, board and committee oversight, incident and breach management, due diligence, risk assessments, background screening, and notifications and issue management. So you can already see it's starting to set the scope for developing that wider supply chain risk management approach and developing a wider TPRM program. So establishing that key governance structure from the outset, have you defined, has the organization defined policies and procedures of how it's going to manage its suppliers? Have you got processes in place to screen and conduct due diligence on those organizations, those suppliers? And once we've got to the stage where those suppliers have been assessed, they have gone through a level of background screening, risk assessment and due diligence, Have you now got formal agreements in place for managing security, managing incident, breach notifications, continuity events, all the areas that you would expect an organization to show due diligence on? And then obviously finally continual monitoring and review of the supply chain. So the fact that we've got a separate domain now and that really covers the end-to-end process of how you would manage a supplier or manage the wider supply chain means that organizations should really be thinking about this more in terms of how the type of questions they're asking third parties, but also have now got a key driver to deliver those type of requirements. Once we get to the contract and agreement section, for example, there's a lot more emphasis on type of controls that should be captured within a contract, whether it's the use of confidentiality and NDAs, through to the way incidents, breaches, and events are monitored and reported, through to key controls and key security controls. So the application of access controls, for example, or data security controls, where a third party is being used who has access to sensitive data and systems. So it's really giving extra emphasis to say, we want you to tell us who your suppliers are and how you're managing them, and that you're managing them effectively, and this includes continual monitoring, performance reviews, on-site, remote audits, or any other method to review your supply base and your wider supply chain. ESG, a subject that is becoming more and more common. I suspect many on the call today are familiar with the concept, or certainly heard of the concept of ESG. It's environmental, social, and governance. We obviously know that this is an ever increasing topic. It's becoming a key discussion topic amongst boards, shareholders, stakeholders, and senior management. So what is ESG though? So I'd say it's still growing, and it's going to be growing for many, many years. It's trying to establish that framework for assessing or for an organization to demonstrate how they meet environmental and social needs based on the products and services they're supplying, how they monitor and manage environmental controls, and how they have a structured governance approach to monitoring and managing the business, ethics around the business, the wider supply chain, and establishing clear risk frameworks and risk methodologies. Now, before in SIG 22, ESG did highlight and was visible in the compliance section, but again, it was a very high level. It asked questions around, do you have an ESG program? Do you have an ESG policy in place? Do you have ESG as part of risk management? But it pretty much ended there in terms of the overall detail. As we can see, in terms of the key topics and risk categories in SIG 23, from environmental, it really has expanded it to look at a lot of the core environmental concerns and expectations of a business. So hazardous and standard waste management and recycling, regulatory compliance, resource management, pollution, carbon footprints, and then the wider policy and environmental management systems that an organization has in place. In terms of social, the corporate social responsibility based expectations, so how organizations put in place controls to monitor and manage and to demonstrate compliance with human rights laws. I mentioned that SIG had expanded to include the UK Modern Slavery Act, for example, as a key standards mapping. Obviously very pertinent here if we're looking at asking third parties about not only them themselves and their wider facilities and operations, but their own supply chain as well. And do they have controls and processes in place to ensure that minimum age, minimum wage is in place, and that there are processes to monitor or alert for or potentials of things like modern slavery and health and safety as well. Health and safety, both from a worker perspective, operational health and safety policies, but also consumer safety. So where there's a need to apply strict regulation compliance, for example, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, obviously those industries working in food and drinks industry, pharmaceutical industries, medical industries, and so on and so forth, are heavily regulation compliant, as we know. And obviously safety and consumer safety is of topmost concern and criticality within those organizations. So now we have a domain that's really asking these questions around, well, how do you ensure that level of safety? What processes or what standards or frameworks do you have in place to manage environmental conditions when you're producing a product or a service? And what plans do you have in place to help monitor environmental conditions? And if there's something of a negative consequence, how that's improved. For example, how you reduce your carbon footprint, how you reduce or control hazardous waste, how you improve recycling and energy efficiency in business operations. And then finally, I say from a governance perspective, governance in terms of how do you manage your wider operations, but then moving on to things like ethics and code of conduct. So diversity and inclusion, ethical sourcing, ensuring that there are clear codes of conduct across the wider supply chain, particularly suppliers, for example, if they're in areas of where geopolitics is quite sensitive at the moment, or there's areas of potentially higher risk in terms of human rights violations or health and safety violations, or bribery cases of bribery, for example. So it's getting extra emphasis to say, how much visibility does the organization have, particularly right at the top, at the board level? And do you have enough process in place to monitor this through risk assessments, through codes of conduct, through visibility of performance, setting SLAs and targets, and ensuring that you've got key policies to continually monitor and, to use an ISO term, continually improve your environmental space in the business and corporate social responsibility as well. As we know, it is still a growing area. I mentioned earlier that the likes of the EU sustainability standards, Modern Slavery Act, UN principles on responsible investment. These are just a few of many standards and frameworks in this space that's continually growing. We expect to see more formalization of standards and frameworks and regulations, both at a national level in the US and in parts of the EU, as well as more international based areas. Some of them already exist, the likes of ISO 26000 on social responsibility, but we expect to see a significant increase in standards and frameworks. So I suspect that when we're looking at this a year from now and looking at SIG 2024, chances are there'll be more best practices and more enhancements to this area, particularly around the areas of governance and sort of how it relates to the wider sort of operations of a business. So a very new domain, quite a lot of work gone into this domain, and as you can see, in terms of the type of risk area, domain categories, it's certainly an area that gives pause for thought, particularly as it is obviously still very different from perhaps where SIG tradition has gone down, as I say, around information security and privacy, and cybersecurity requirements and general operational requirements as well. There's always been compliance requirements in SIG around the likes of anti-bribery, anti-corruption, legal and regulatory adherence and monitoring. So this, if anything, just enhances that a next step further. So the significant increase in ESG requirements means greater insight into each of those core concepts, particularly around policy and governance. So asking, have formal policies been established for managing and monitoring environmental conditions and sustainability? An EMS, or an environmental management system. Anyone familiar with ISO and ISO 14001 will be familiar with this concept. So our environmental management systems in place to measure and improve operations. And ethics in the workplace. Is a business and its suppliers providing ethical working conditions? Are processes for ensuring employee consumer safety established? So a lot of key topics here. And again, this is where the benefit of the risk categories can come into it. The more insight we get from our vendors and our wider supply chain, the more visibility we get in terms of, are they in areas of potential political instability, or areas that are more prone to unethical practices? Can we start to use these as drivers for mandatory controls, and use the categories as a means of validating and measuring compliance from the third parties and the practices that they have in place? So quite a lot of change in the ESG, but certainly, as they giving quite a strong driver for ensuring that these areas are picked up when engaging with the third parties. So we move on to talking about, well, what does this mean for SIG and the wider third-party risk management process? So SIG 23 provides a comprehensive suite of controls, policies, and processes to assess a third party against. And obviously, organizations can take those controls and identify which domains are relevant to their supply base. So you have quite a large variety and type of controls, as we've seen, everything from ESG to access control, IT operations to business continuity, data privacy and data security, and enterprise risk management as well. So it gives you quite a large scope and remit when starting out or reviewing your third-party risk management process. So control domains help to provide visibility and security, privacy in business systems and practices. And the fact that there's a full or SIG core and light-based assessments should also help, and can also help in terms of if you're starting off in the TPRM program, but also if you're going through that review period as well. Can we use a blend of both frameworks? That is a very common approach we do see, particularly where you do find organizations who are tiering their vendors and want to make sure that we're asking the right questions and the right level of detail and flexibility based on the right vendor, and we're not getting risks back that are deemed unwarranted or inappropriate risks. One of the areas just to add, as part of the effort to update the framework and to add new questions and to amend questions, is it also calls to mind the strengthening as well of the way the questions are formatted. This concept of the parent and child relationship remains there and still remains very relevant. The concept of the parent and child, of course, being that the manner in which you answer one question will dictate how other questions are appearing or not appearing. And obviously this is very important to identify, particularly when we're reviewing the SIG and looking at, well, what does it mean for my TPRM and the direction that I want to go into? Obviously, once we've identified those new standards mappings, we've identified the new domains and critical new controls out there, it should then help to start to identify what do we deem mandatory. So thinking about what does ESG mean to us and our industry sector is an area that we need to pay particular attention to, given the nature of what we do, what we're being supplied by our vendor base. Is it an area that we need to really focus on? Or are we comfortable with looking at other aspects of the SIG? Do third parties utilize suppliers, and do these suppliers have access to sensitive data? So asking these type of key questions to ascertain, either through vendor profiling and tiering or through other means of due diligence, should help to shape how a SIG framework is used in the TPRM program and process. So as I say, because of the comprehensive nature of the SIG and the volume of domains and domain types, and because it covers not just security and privacy, but business operations and compliance and regulatory matters as well, There really is a lot of flexibility and a lot of detail that organizations can go into to make sure you're asking the right risks for the right vendors at the right time. So what can we do now? So having had a look at a lot of the core changes and perhaps some of the more fundamental changes that shared assessments have made to its framework, we can now start to look at how to develop that SIG risk assessment process. So using the framework to define and build a third-party risk assessment, and again, that emphasis of using both light and core frameworks, particularly when you're looking at tiering and doing different tiers based on different third-party profiles. The critical control domains is really important to understand, and looking at from a business perspective, what's important to us. If we take a look back at those 18, if we take a look back at these 18 or 19 domains, each one, I say, has a clear purpose. Each one is quite clear in what the outputs are, but there's also a lot of interlinking as well, we can see, which is particularly important when if we're focused on particular risk categories and we want to focus on particular control points. And so obviously understanding what each of these domains are, what those changes are, particularly around, let's say, the compliance management, operation and privacy management, the need to gain further understanding and confidence that organizations have clear governance structure in place is very important. And that becomes one indication of where we can expand our TPRM program to ask more relevant questions related to governance and how an organization is managing its information or cyber or privacy systems overall. And then, of course, through the fourth and nth party in ESG, where we want to identify new topics. Of course, there will naturally be challenges here, obviously not least with ESG, where because it is such a new topic and it is capturing a lot of areas that will be very different to organizations. There'll be some businesses, of course, that are very familiar with ESG and use areas such as environmental or health and safety management systems as part of their standard business operations. If you think about the manufacturing industry, for example, those areas that are normally very successful in having good environmental and sort of health and safety processes in place. But of course, there'll be other vendors and other industries where these are still very new topics. So understanding what each of these means from a SIG perspective, and this is where the benefit of those standards mappings can come into play. Understanding the particular requirements from the EU sustainability or the UN responsibility requirements can obviously help provide some of that context. So use of standards mapping within SIG to identify those critical controls and identify when new control areas are considered high priority or critical domains. So obviously, once we've got to the stage where we've established what those critical domains are, and we've really reviewed what does ESG mean to us, the fourth and nth party in the wider supply chain, based on what we're doing now, how can we enhance that? How can we add to that? Or are we already asking the right questions of our vendors in terms of how they're managing the wider supply chain? We can then start to look at engaging the third parties and running our TPRM process in the standard manner. It's also obviously highlights it's worth mentioning, obviously the tail end of that, which is obviously the addressing of those risks as well. So setting out risk mitigation and remediation plans, particularly based on those new areas. one thing obviously to notice about SIG is there's a lot of technical detail in there. There's a lot of different terminologies that are used, and of course that's only going to increase with the advent of ESG and an increase of the fourth and nth party domains, to making sure that vendors are fully aware of what they mean, what these domains mean, and what this terminology means as well. So having said that, before I turn over to Q&As, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Scott.
Hey, thanks so much, Thomas. If you want to stop sharing your screen, I'll share mine, and just want to share a couple slides with everyone here today. All right, just a quick confirmation from you, Thomas. Can you see my screen okay?
I do, yes.
All right, very good. Thanks everybody for joining the webinar today to learn a little bit more about what's changed in the SIG 2023 over 22. I think shared assessments has really continually evolved the SIG questionnaire, the overall program, to really accommodate the needs of where the market is going. You know, if you're a hockey fan, you understand the phrase, you got to ski where the puck is going, or skate rather to where the puck is going. And, you know, I think shared assessments is really accomplishing that task with some of the latest enhancements. I wanted to share with you, if I could, just a little bit of how Prevalent helps to maximize your efforts in third-party risk management, especially as it pertains to utilizing the SIG questionnaire. What we see is that organizations are generally looking to accomplish three things. Number one, get the data they need to make good decisions. Help them knock down enterprise silos in the organization, increase their efficiency in how they manage a vendor throughout their life cycle. And number three, just be able to evolve and scale their program over time. And you know, Prevalent specializes in helping organizations accomplish these three tasks specifically. And we do this through a combination of our people, the data in our platform, and the capabilities in the platform itself. You know, we offer the ability to host the SIG questionnaire in our platform and then perform all of the hard work of collection, analysis, and management of those risks using the SIG questionnaire on your behalf. Those managed services deliver something like a 50% reduction in the manual work you have to do to assess your vendors and suppliers. Second is we add context to the risks that we discover through the SIG assessment, and that is through the incorporation of third-party risk intelligence from cyber, business, financial, reputational sources, ESG sources, and more to help add context and richness and to help inform that decision-making process. And the third, we host all of that capability in our platform to help you centralize it, add workflow to it, ditch spreadsheets once and for all, and give you some program level risk and process reporting that you can send up the chain, that you can utilize from an enterprise perspective across departments between procurement, security, data privacy, and more, so that everybody's singing from the same hymnal, so to speak, from a third-party risk perspective. It's also important to note that we don't see third-party risk as one-time static operation to perform some sort of pre-contract due diligence, or maybe a one-time per year assessment of a vendor when it comes time for contract renewal. We see risk that you know, pervades the entire third-party vendor and supplier lifecycle, from the point you source and select a vendor and onboard them to the time you offboard and terminate that relationship when that arrangement or that contract comes to an end. From our perspective, there's distinct risks at every one of those stages of the life cycle, and each has to be managed with the same discipline and rigor that you're utilizing to, you know, assess the vendor on a regular basis. And then, of course, we've got capabilities built in the platform to help you accomplish that specifically, not just a great library of assessments, including the SIG, but the ability to, you know, utilize our platform to manage the evaluation of vendors before you onboard them, to manage the contract lifecycle, to create a comprehensive vendor profile using all of those insights we mentioned, and then utilize the platform for continuous reporting and analytics, SLA and performance reporting, incident response automation, and then providing offboarding checklists at the end of that relationship. At the end of the day, our objective is to help you accomplish 3 things. Number one, to help make you and the rest of your team smarter and more well-informed on your third-party risk status, your vendor and supplier status. We do that by delivering you, comprehensive risk analytics and inputs, and then continuous performance and SLA insights, data-driven analytics based on AI and ML models, and then role-based reporting to help you deliver that reporting to whoever it needs to see it throughout the enterprise. Second is to unify different teams, capabilities, and the life cycle of managing that vendor or supplier throughout the relationship. And third, to give you the prescriptive guidance, whether it's from built-in intelligence and remediation recommendations to the workflow and risk response that's automated, to the army of the folks we have behind the product to help support you, to give you the prescription you need to help reduce a risk down to an acceptable level from your third-party vendors and suppliers throughout the relationship. So that's our take on third-party risk. We've been a long-time partner of shared assessments. We host the SIG Lite. It's the foundation of some of our vendor intelligence sharing networks, and several of our customers leverage us to host and manage that on their behalf and execute the assessments for them. So happy to take any questions, but Melissa, I'll open it up to you, and we'll ask questions for Thomas too.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. Now I think a lot of you have already gotten the hint, but if you have a question, throw it in the Q&A. We already have quite a bit we'll get through, hopefully. And I'm going to launch the second poll real quick on that screen. We want to see, if there's a project happening. I know, budgets are getting established for 2023 quickly, so maybe you're in the same boat. But, anyway, let's jump into these questions. We have quite a bit. So I see that ESG is a large domain. Do you think that this will be further broken down into more categories in the future?
Good question. Yes, it is. It's a very significant change and quite a large domain. I think there is a potential too, particularly as standards become more consistent and formalized, and as we see, I say one of the expectations over the next 12 months, if not longer, is we'll see more adoption of standard best practice. I mean, if it got to the stage where, for example, the environmental piece, there were more and more expectations and requirements coming in, yes, I would expect that, and for me, it would make more sense to break it out, but still have that categorization of ESG. So yeah, I think it's absolutely possible, but a lot of that will be driven by, again, as I say, sort of standards and regulations around ESG and that becoming more formal on the global scale.
Perfect. All right, second question for you. Does the SIG Lite 2023 capture more questions regarding cloud policy and controls around cloud infrastructure?
It doesn't. There's a slight increase, and there's some what shared assessments calls question text delta, which is where they have an existing question and they've amended something within that question. The aim obviously being to make it easier to understand or to interpret. But no, there's been no significant increase actually in the cloud domain.
All right, third question for you. I'm trying to jam through these. Is the governance piece similar to ISO 27001 ISMS?
It is, yes. So I mentioned governance quite a few times, and when you look at both the IT operations and the information assurance domains, both of them start with identifying policy and roles and responsibilities and management commitment. And when you look at ISO 27001, and even thinking about the new 27001 that was very recently launched by ISO, it still covers that same concept of management commitment, and then sort of driving that commitment through defined roles and responsibilities, and sort of monitoring and continued improvement. So yes, those topics and that type of governance, as I say, has increased and exists in the SIG.
Perfect. All right, next one for you. One of the biggest challenges we have is with the enormity of the SIG. Many of our suppliers are smaller in nature, like mom and pop shops, as opposed to IBMs. Is there any plan or guidance on how to use the SIG to assess smaller organizations?
Absolutely. So, and yes, this is a very real challenge for actually any standard, but certainly given how big SIG is. As say, looking at light from 350 down to 150. If memory serves me, the current SIG 2023 light is 126 questions. Don't quote me on that. But it can still seem quite a daunting task. There's obviously a couple of things to note with not just the SIG actually, but for any standard, but perhaps more so the SIG, is the adoption of the parent and child relationship is really important there to make sure that you're not overloading, particularly those very small organizations with too many questions that either don't matter to them or completely irrelevant. One of the aspects that we deploy and that we see used effectively with organizations is the concept of profiling and tiering. And the more that we can get to understand our vendors and the capabilities of what they offer, does make it easier to dictate or understand, certainly when we have the SIG light, what is relevant and what is irrelevant. But yes, particularly for those very, very small one-man bands, little 5-person little ad agencies and mum and pop shops, I'd recommend focusing purely on the SIG light, but really have a looking at the top level questions only. Because once you look at the top level questions, by that stage, across all of the 19 domains, you will already have, I guess, anywhere between 30 to 50 controls that I guess you would consider typically being mandatory controls, regardless of the type of company. So do you have an information security policy? Do you assign user identification for new users who are joining the business? Do you have a BC plan? Those type of questions that even the very smallest company maybe will find not only useful, but will apply to them as well. So yes, there's a few different tricks you can take to go through, but certainly looking at how you sort of understand your vendors, the way you profile them, or if you're able to do a profiling and tiering of vendor, and then starting on the SIG light and really looking at those top level questions. But it is a challenge though. It's yeah.
All right, I think we have time for one more. So in regards to risk qualification versus risk quantification, do you envision that a SIG light or core and or the CAIQ expand into a risk quantification realm?
In regards to critical qualification, do you envision that SIG and expand? It's hard to say. I don't think so, just because of the nature of personally, I think because of the nature of the SIG and how what's the right word to use, how open it is in terms of how it's trying to be used by any industry in any sector in the world, and it has to be relatively generic, for want of a better word, in that space. I don't, yeah, I personally, I don't think so, but let's wait and see.
Okay. Well, we're pretty much at the top of the hour. I'm going to wrap it up here, but if you do have additional questions, check out the screen. I think if you can see it, let me end this poll. info@prevalent.net should be able to help you out there. Sorry we couldn't get to everybody, but thank you for all your questions. Thomas gave us some great insight of what to expect in the upcoming year, which is approaching quickly, and I hope to see many of you at a future webinar. Take care, everybody. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.